Protesters angry over Iran's struggling economy.
Iran is boiling over. Across Iran, protests are demanding the fall of the dictator, with students, workers, and ordinary citizens taking to the streets. Students chant, shopkeepers strike, as a collapsing economy, skyrocketing inflation, and a deadly water crisis push millions to their breaking point. The unrest has caught global attention, with Donald Trump issuing stern warnings that threaten to escalate tensions further. The Bazaar finally breaks decades-old alliances with the Islamic Republic. Iran's government, long seen as unshakable, now faces open defiance at every level. The people of Iran are united, and the question on everyone's mind: is the Islamic Republic on the edge of collapse? No longer if change will come, but when. Across Iran, a wave of protests has erupted that is shaking the very foundations of the Islamic Republic. Protests calling for death to the dictator erupt across Iran. From the heart of Tehran to major cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, and Malad, streets are filled with chants that could no longer be ignored. Death to the dictator, woman, life, freedom, and down with Khamenei. These are not isolated demonstrations. This is a nationwide outpouring of frustration, anger, and determination. Students, traders, salaried workers, and ordinary citizens are joining forces in a remarkable show of unity, demanding not reforms, but systemic change. The protest began in response to the collapse of Iran's currency, the rial, which plunged to historic lows against the US dollar. Shops in Tehran's Grand Bazaar and across major urban centres closed their doors, creating both an economic and symbolic strike. Mobile phone and electronics vendors, who often serve as a barometer of urban discontent, were among the first to signal resistance. From there, the movement spread rapidly to universities, dormitories, and residential neighbourhoods. Students were particularly vocal, chanting slogans from rooftops and calling on their peers to join the demonstrations. In Malad, near Tehran, one student explained, "They have closed the gates, and special forces on motorcycles are circling us. We are determined. Some of us may be arrested. Things could get worse. But we will not back down." The scope of participation marks a key turning point. Unlike previous protests that were often concentrated in a single sector, students, women, or specific labour groups, this wave is multidimensional. Middle-class families, who once enjoyed a semblance of financial stability, are feeling the brunt of inflation, rising food prices, and collapsing purchasing power. Even low-income households, already struggling with scarcity, are pouring into the streets. As one Tehran resident described the shared anxiety, "Everyone has reached their limit, in every sense. Authorities responded predictably, but the scale of repression reveals both vulnerability and fear. Security forces, including motorcycle-mounted paramilitaries and the Basij, moved into neighbourhoods and dormitories, firing tear gas and making arrests. State media sought to frame the protests as purely economic, emphasising the closure of shops and fluctuating currency rates. But social media footage tells a different story. Videos show citizens defying the regime with chants explicitly targeting Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the Islamic Republic itself. "Freedom, freedom, freedom!" protesters cried in Tehran, while others marched chanting, "Down with dictator!" The political significance cannot be overstated. In Iran, university campuses have historically served as hotbeds of activism. The current mobilization shows students taking leadership once more, but now they are joined by the nation's economic backbone, the bazaar merchants, whose historical alliance with the regime has frayed under decades of economic mismanagement, inflation, and corruption. The message is clear. The protests are no longer just about living conditions. They are a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the ruling establishment. International reactions have added a new dimension. Israel openly welcomed the protests, framing them as a potential pathway to regime change, while former US President Donald Trump warned of military intervention should Iran rebuild its nuclear or missile programs. Within the country, these external pressures have mixed effects. On one hand, the regime frames foreign involvement as a threat, but on the other, protesters view the global spotlight as validation of their grievances. Analysts note that these protests differ fundamentally from previous waves in scale, scope, and endurance. The combination of economic collapse, declining public services, student activism, and open defiance from key societal sectors like the Bazaar creates a scenario the regime has struggled to contain. Unlike past uprisings, the movement is resilient and decentralized, making suppression increasingly difficult. Iran's government is attempting damage control. President Masoud Pezeshkian has called for dialogue with protest leaders, stating that the government will listen to their demands and implement reforms to stabilize the economy. Yet, for many citizens, this comes too late. The cumulative frustration over decades of mismanagement, compounded by soaring inflation, water shortages, and a collapsing currency, has eroded trust beyond repair. As protests erupted across Iran in late 2025, former US President Donald Trump warns Iran after protests turned deadly across several provinces, intensifying the already volatile situation. On Truth Social, Trump wrote, "If Iran shots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter." The statement, blunt and uncompromising, underscored the US willingness to intervene if the regime escalated violence against demonstrators, placing Iran's leaders in an unprecedented strategic and political dilemma. Iranian authorities reacted swiftly, portraying Trump's warning as a direct threat to national sovereignty. Ali Larijani, Iran's national security chief, declared on X that any US interference would trigger disruption across the entire region and the destruction of American interests. Similarly, Ali Shamkhani, an advisor to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, warned, "Every hand of intervention that approaches Iranian security will be cut off with a regrettable response." Even Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, issued one of the most direct threats, stating that US forces across the Middle East would become legitimate targets if Washington took action. Trump's warnings, while intended to support protesters, also complicated the domestic situation. Iranian officials leveraged the threat of foreign intervention to rally nationalist sentiment and portray the protests as part of a Western plot, seeking to delegitimize domestic dissent. Meanwhile, protesters on the ground faced a delicate balancing act. They sought to continue voicing their grievances, chanting slogans like "Freedom, freedom, freedom" and "Down with dictator," without giving the regime an excuse to escalate force under the pretext of defending sovereignty. Analysts highlight the paradox. If the US acts, it risks provoking a regional conflict with unpredictable consequences. If it fails to act, it may embolden the regime, undermining the morale of demonstrators. Ali Vaez, director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, described the situation as a stark strategic dilemma for Washington, emphasizing the high stakes for both the Iranian people and US interests in the region. Ultimately, Trump's warning added another layer of pressure to an already unstable situation. While it signaled potential international support for protesters, it also gave the Iranian regime a narrative to justify crackdowns. The protests, therefore, exist in a tense environment where domestic dissent intersects with global politics, leaving both the Iranian people and the regime navigating a precarious path between demands for freedom and the looming threat of external military escalation. The economic heartbeat of Iran, the Grand Bazaar, has become a symbol of defiance against the regime. Historically, the bazaar and its merchants, known as the Bazaris, were pillars of the Islamic Republic, providing both financial and social support. But by late December 2025, this relationship had fractured. Traders across Tehran and other major cities began closing their shops in protest, citing the collapse of the Iranian rial, soaring inflation, and government policies that prioritized missiles and security over ordinary livelihoods. As one former wholesale shoe merchant explained, "They tell me I'm lucky I shut my shop and left. They lose less money if they keep their shops closed now than if they sell their goods, because it's impossible to replace the stock at the same price." The strike quickly spread beyond Tehran's Grand Bazaar, pulling in smaller traders, shopkeepers, and market vendors in cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad. The protest began on Sunday afternoon after mobile phone and electronic shopkeepers in Tehran shut their stores as the real currency fell to a record low of 1.42 million to the dollar. Even when traders attempted to sell, daily price fluctuations rendered transactions unprofitable, deepening the sense of desperation. The strike is not just about money, it is a political act. By refusing to engage with a system that they see as unfair, the merchants are signalling that the regime's economic mismanagement cannot continue unchallenged. The bazaar strikes also intersected with student and middle-class protests, creating a rare alignment of different social groups. As Morteza Nemati Zargaran, a university professor, warned, "What action can you take if the protesters' representatives challenge the country's overarching policies? And what will you do if they are arrested by power centres beyond your government?" The alignment of traders, students, and salaried workers amplified the pressure on the government, making it clear that the unrest could no longer be contained through economic or political concessions alone. State media attempted to frame the closures as purely economic, emphasizing traders' concern about currency fluctuations rather than politics. But social media and independent reporting painted a different picture, showing merchants chanting anti-government slogans and joining protests on the streets. The strikes illustrate a profound shift. Even the regime's traditional supporters are losing faith. By withdrawing their participation from the economic system, the bazaar is delivering a powerful message. The Islamic Republic can no longer rely on its old networks of loyalty to maintain control. For the first time in decades, Iran's most traditional and historically loyal constituency, the Bazaar, finally breaks with the Islamic Republic. Once inseparable allies, the conservative merchants and religious institutions that funded the 1979 revolution now see their alliance with the regime as irreparably broken. The Bazaar, which had long served as a backbone of the state both economically and politically, is now a centre of resistance. Merchants argue that they are being forced to sacrifice their livelihoods to fund the government's regional ambitions, missile programs, and security apparatus, while ordinary Iranians struggle to survive. One trader bluntly stated, "The economy cannot sustain the vows to rebuild the missile arsenal. We are suffocating for their ambitions." This historic rupture is driven by economic desperation, political frustration, and the government's failure to manage the country's finances. Chronic inflation, now hovering around 60%, and a collapsing rial make it impossible for merchants to maintain inventories or conduct normal business. Centralised allocation of foreign currency has slowed imports, forcing some traders to sell at a loss. If they reject state-mandated pricing, they risk accusations of hoarding or price gouging. If they comply, they cannot afford to restock, effectively selling themselves into bankruptcy. The Bazaar's protest is not just a response to mismanagement, it is a direct critique of the regime's priorities, highlighting the human cost of state spending on military projects over public welfare. State efforts to contain the unrest have so far been superficial. The government replaced the central bank chief, Mohammad Reza Farzin, with Abdelnazer Hemati, a former official previously fired over the same issues. As one analyst noted, replacing him signals continuity, not reform. Meanwhile, state media showcased photo-op meetings with select supportive businessmen to downplay the growing dissent. But the message from the streets and the markets is unmistakable. The people and the bazaar speak with one voice, demanding fundamental change. Public slogans and chants now extend beyond simple economic complaints, criticizing specific government policies and priorities. The regime faces a stark choice: abandon its regional ambitions and military spending to address domestic crises, or double down on repression. With security forces already opening fire on protesters, it is clear the Islamic Republic has chosen the latter. Yet, by alienating the bazaar, the backbone of its economic and social support, the regime has entered uncharted territory. The alliance that once guaranteed stability has fractured, leaving Iran's leadership more isolated than ever. The economic pressure on Iran's population has reached a critical point, creating a perfect storm that has fueled nationwide protests. According to Iran's Government Statistics Center, food prices are up 72% and medical goods 50% compared with this time last year. Salaried workers and middle-class families, who once enjoyed relative stability, now find themselves struggling to meet basic needs. As journalist Mohammed Parsi wrote on X, "In this country, first buying a home became a dream, then a car, a phone, travel, and now even essential goods are disappearing from daily life, just like that, in one of the richest countries in the world." Ordinary Iranians face a harsh reality. Even purchasing snacks can pose a financial risk, turning everyday life into a series of impossible choices. The collapse of the Iranian rial has intensified the crisis. By late December 2025, the currency had fallen to 1.42 million to the dollar, more than 40% below its value in June, and recovery has been minimal. Traders and shopkeepers shut down their businesses as they could not afford to restock inventory at skyrocketing prices. This currency collapse, coupled with rising fuel and utility costs, has eroded purchasing power across the board. Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's president, acknowledged the severity of the crisis, saying in Parliament, "I have no motivation to remain in government or to remain president if I cannot solve the problems of the people and the deprived. This is not something I want to be proud of. We cannot govern while people have problems. They say salaries are low, so they are low. They say you are taking too much in taxes, so we are taking too much tax. On the other side, they say increase salaries. Someone tell me where I should get the money from to give." The state's budget priorities further exacerbate the strain. While subsidies for essential goods have been reduced, spending on defence and security continues to rise, forcing the population to shoulder the cost of government policies through higher taxes and the erosion of their savings. Public anger is compounded by the perception that the regime's regional ambitions, particularly missile proliferation and military projects, take precedence over basic human needs. Low-income and middle-class families are being squeezed from both ends. Housing markets are collapsing, medical emergencies drain savings, and even modest daily expenses now feel unattainable. The cumulative effect of high inflation, currency collapse, and government mismanagement has created a scenario where economic survival itself has become an act of defiance. Iranians are no longer just protesting political repression. They are rebelling against a system that has rendered their lives financially unsustainable. Economic pressure, therefore, is not merely a backdrop. It is the catalyst for the ongoing unrest, uniting students, traders, and ordinary citizens in a collective demand for change. The combination of skyrocketing prices, plummeting currency value, and government neglect has transformed daily survival into a political statement, leaving the Islamic Republic with few tools to contain the growing crisis. Beyond economic collapse and political unrest, Tehran faces a far graver existential threat: a looming water crisis that could make the city uninhabitable. Over the past 5 years, extreme drought and decades of mismanaged water infrastructure have left reservoirs supplying Iran's capital at critical lows. By early November 2025, the reservoir behind Amir Kabir Dam, a main source of drinking water for Tehran, had dropped to about 8% of its capacity. President Masoud Pezeshkian warned that if water levels continue to decline, the capital would have to be moved, a statement underscoring the severity of the crisis. The combination of record-high summer temperatures approaching 50 degrees Celsius and consecutive years of reduced precipitation has created a perfect storm for water scarcity. Hydrologists attribute the crisis not only to climate change, but also to decades of mismanagement. Iran built one of the world's largest networks of dams, many on rivers too small to sustain them, while over 1 million wells have drained underground aquifers. More than half of the country's ancient Qanat systems, ingenious gravity-fed tunnels that once sustainably supplied water, are now dry. As freshwater expert Kevin Madani noted, the dramatic water security issues of Iran are rooted in decades of disintegrated planning and managerial myopia. The destruction of these sustainable systems, combined with ongoing overpumping, has left Tehran on the brink of what experts describe as water bankruptcy. The human and economic consequences are staggering. A shortage of water threatens not only drinking supplies, but also agriculture, electricity generation, and public health. Urban infrastructure, already strained by decades of unchecked growth, risks collapse as subsidence and aquifer depletion continue. Residents face a future where daily survival may depend on rationing water, and where entire neighbourhoods could become unlivable. The government's proposed relocation of the capital to wetter coastal regions may take decades and cost an estimated $100 billion, leaving immediate solutions out of reach. The protests sweeping Iran in late 2025 raise a crucial question. Where will they ultimately lead? The unrest has expanded far beyond students and the Bazaar to include salaried workers, middle-class families, and citizens from nearly every province, creating a unified front against a regime widely seen as unresponsive to public needs. Slogans like "Down with dictator" and "Freedom, freedom, freedom" echo from Tehran to Mashhad, Isfahan, and Shiraz, signalling a nationwide desire for systemic change rather than mere economic relief. Yet the trajectory of these protests is uncertain. On one hand, the regime still retains a formidable security apparatus, from the Basij paramilitary forces to riot police and heavy surveillance systems. Iranian officials have issued stern warnings, with Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf stating that all American centers and forces across the entire region will be legitimate targets for us in response to any potential actions, demonstrating the regime's willingness to project strength both domestically and internationally. History shows that the Islamic Republic has repeatedly relied on force to suppress dissent, and state media continues to downplay the protests as economic rather than political in nature. On the other hand, the protesters are emboldened by both internal and external factors. Economic collapse, hyperinflation, the plummeting rial, and chronic water shortages have created conditions where everyday survival itself becomes a political act. International attention, including US warnings from Donald Trump, and expressions of concern from the State Department adds pressure on Tehran while highlighting the global stakes of its internal instability. Analysts like Ali Vaez from the International Crisis Group warn that inaction or excessive intervention by foreign powers could either embolden the regime or escalate the conflict beyond Iran's borders. Ultimately, the protests may force a recalibration of Iran's governance. The government's limited resources, combined with widespread alienation of key societal pillars like the Bazaar, make a simple crackdown insufficient to restore order. While immediate collapse of the regime is unlikely, the unrest is reshaping the social contract. Citizens are no longer passive observers, but active participants demanding accountability, economic justice, and political reform. The protests could either result in partial concessions, such as dialogue mechanisms and policy adjustments, or, if ignored, escalate into prolonged national unrest, potentially weakening Tehran's control permanently. In essence, the end of these protests is not merely about regime survival, it is about whether Iran can address the deep structural crises that sparked them. Citizens are asking not only for relief from economic and environmental hardship, but for a future where governance aligns with the people's needs, making this uprising a defining moment in the nation's modern history. Iran stands at a crossroads. From Tehran's universities to its historic bazaars, from middle-class homes to parched reservoirs, the nation is crying out for change. The protests are no longer isolated events. They are a nationwide reckoning against economic collapse, environmental disaster, and political repression. Whether through dialogue, reform, or continued unrest, the Iranian people have made it clear they will not accept a system that sacrifices their livelihoods, freedom, and future. The world watches as Tehran faces an unprecedented challenge. One thing is certain: the path forward will shape Iran for decades to come.